final exam and all that this year and registration, and thank the faculty members, Dr. Klein here, and several others who reviewed as judges but couldn't be here for classes, conference, wedding. Cheryl is here, right? Cheryl is Dr. Asher, who's one of the judges. She could tell you that it's a hard decision, which is why we end up with 4 winners as opposed to the regular 2. Okay? So let me just, without further ado, announce the winners first. I know you're all eager to find out who won. And also give a couple minutes or 5 to 10 minutes for Mr. Haynes. He just shared some of his ventures in business with this table. It's just so exciting. I'm sure that you guys would enjoy the story. So I will first announce when the first prize winner this year is Adrianna. Reijula. Acknowledge that Erica's mom is here today. She must be so proud. And then we have 2 honorable mentions. Michael Morelli. Stochel, who rushed back from the conference just on time to do another presentation here today. All right, so Mr. Haynes, if you don't mind to tell us a little bit about yourself. We had last year's winner, by the way, here. We had to tape you, right?
Yes,
right?
yes.
Mm-hmm. So, and Mr. Haynes actually is also a Adam Smith winner, class of 79.
When you had to type on a typewriter, so it was a challenge. And I'm glad my paper's not up this year because I wouldn't do well. So I'm saying that the great thing about going to a school that's a better school today than it was when you went there is that people think you're smarter than you are when you get here. So that's helpful. I had to embarrass myself and explain that when I was here, it was before the personal computer was invented. So I've dated myself now thoroughly. So I guess what I do is I'm involved in taking technologies from universities and trying to build enterprises around them, which really doesn't have anything to do with economics per se. So when I came out of Illinois, the first thing I did in economics was work for what was then Chase Econometrics with a few economists and a lot of physicists, and then you realize the importance of math and economics. So it was a bit of a change for me because it was an area that I did work in, but it wasn't my principal interest, and gave me really a different sense as to the use of economics, and particularly the application of economic theory in what was apparent to me was the real world then. So I quickly decided not to do that after a while, since I didn't want to continue to work with a bunch of physicists. And today, the company I'm involved in is all a bunch of physicists, so it's things come back around. The utility, I think, of an economics education is principally that it teaches you to think and to analyze clearly. And I'm not sure that I use a lot of microeconomics on any given day, but the ability to look at a problem and to think about that issue critically and to come up with a hypothesis as to how one might approach it is probably the greatest use of an economics education. And I was an arts and sciences major, so I don't know anything about accounting. So I have to live in the theoretical world. But we were talking earlier that nobody really ends up doing what they think they're going to do when they graduate from college, and that's probably a good thing and a bad thing. The bad thing is if you think about spending time trying to plot your career path, the idea that 20 years later you may be doing something that doesn't directly relate to that, you wonder why you can't get to what you're ultimately going to do. The good thing is, if you have a good, solid undergraduate preparation, I think you're well positioned both to go to graduate school, to be in the working world, and to come in and out of academics, which I think is more typical today than it was certainly when I graduated. So I've been in and out of graduate programs, finished graduate programs, I should say, several times. And the ability to go back and pick that up and to use that tool set to develop here, I think is both personally fulfilling and also more typical of the way that all of us will go forward in our careers. So congratulations to everybody who wrote and submitted their papers. Looking forward to hearing the presentations. I have to apologize for having to leave early to deal with something today. But again, congratulations to the winners, and Dr. Mao, thank you for having me back. Dr. Thornawala, good to see you after many years.
Does he still owe you homework?
So he said he still has grades in his office, which I find disconcerting. But I hope you can't find mine. Thanks again.
So my name is Adrianna Rockford, and I did my paper on the governance structure and the occurrence of capital flight in sub-Saharan Africa. And before I get to the results and how I did my study, I just kind of want to give some background information to kind of contextualize the study, and basically tell you my motivation for getting into this topic and this region in particular. So first off, this region is one of the most capital scarce areas of the world. And as of 1998, it held 29 of the 38 most severely indebted low-income countries. So I read a lot of studies, and when they combined the external debt, it equaled $398 billion from 1970 to 2004. Over that same period of time, they also experienced what they calculated as capital flight in the form of $607 billion US dollars when you adjusted it for interest rates. So basically, why I kind of picked this is that the total combined liabilities of these countries is a lot less than the total combined capital flight, and I was wanting to know why that was. And if the capital is leaving the country is losing out on a lot. Not only are they losing out on capital, but they're losing out on the tax revenue that they could have had if, say, it was invested domestically. And then this tax revenue could have then gone to the debt relief of their enormous amounts of indebtedness. Also, this area of the world has the highest infant mortality rate as of 2007 and the highest illiteracy rates. So clearly the capital is not only going to, not the debt relief, but it's not going to these human development programs either. So there's clearly a capital allocation problem in this area. So this is why I focused on that. Okay, so capital flight occurs all over the world. It's not just in developing countries. It's actually the largest amount of capital flight is from places like the Middle East and oil-rich countries and in Latin America. However, scholars have found that capital flight is actually most detrimental to the economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's because they're extremely small GDPs. So they calculate this measurement called the burden of capital flight. And what it is basically capital flight as a percentage of GDP. So since these countries have really small GDPs, capital flight is a lot more detrimental because it's a larger percentage. And basically, like I said before, it poses a threat to the advancement of human capital because it erodes away the tax base. And then it leaves governments having to choose where to put their money, either education or healthcare or towards debt relief or even sometimes towards industrial policies and export-oriented policies and things like that would promote economic growth and standard of living for all, but they end up not having enough or actually partaking in capital flight. So that's kind of the problem there. So what is capital flight? And when I first started out, I was getting a lot of different results on what it actually is. And basically the difference between the interpretations lie in how they distinguish what's normal capital outflow in a country and what's abnormal. And so these are all these are the methods I've come across, and I ended up using the residual method. And I give sort of the reasons why I didn't use these other methods. So the first one, the hot money method, what it does is it focuses on the short-term outflows of capital, and that's what they consider the capital flight to be, as opposed to the long-term and medium-term capital outflows. And I felt like that was kind of problematic because it admits it omits the largest amount of capital outflow, which is the long-term ones. The next one is the Dooley method, and I also found that to be somewhat problematic because what it does is it measures capital flight as the outflows that do not receive interest rates. And what I was finding was that a lot of the determinants of capital flight were variables that would make a country more conducive to investment. So clearly these decisions were portfolio decisions as opposed to like embezzlement and things like that. So I felt like that was too narrow as well, because capital that's invested abroad that receives interest rates will also be detrimental to the economic growth of the sub-Saharan countries. The next one's trade misinvoicing, and that kind of takes into the inaccuracy of trade data. And I feel like that was sort of unrelated. The asset method measures capital flight as the stock of assets held abroad, held at foreign banks. And the problem with that was I couldn't find enough information. So that left me with the residual method, which is the one I use to calculate capital flight in these countries. Okay, so the reason I liked this method the most was because it basically acknowledges the difficulties of separating the abnormal from normal outflows. And so what it does is all the capital outflow that is not in the current account or in the foreign reserve stock, they measure as capital flight. So as you can see from the equation, basically the change in debt plus the foreign direct investment is basically the inflows, and then they subtract the outflows, which would be the outflow of capital due to a current account deficit or a trade imbalance, and also plus the stock of official foreign reserves. So that would be capital outflowing due to the purchasing of foreign currency. And basically the inflows are in the form of foreign direct investment, which is like investment in real things like infrastructure or factories for foreign enterprises. And the debt is basically loans from foreign institutions or foreign countries and things like that. So basically how they use the capital, and then what the difference is, what I calculated as capital flight. And I was able to get this data pretty readily available to me. It was in the World Bank debt tables and the International Monetary Fund balance of payment statistics, so that wasn't a problem. Okay, a lot of the studies that I was reading while trying to figure out what I was going to use as my independent variables, they used macroeconomic variables, so like the fiscal and monetary policies of these countries as the determinants of capital flight. So basically these variables are things that make a country more conducive to investment. I gave like the most popular 5 variables that these studies did. So in stable inflation, budget deficit, overvaluation of exchange rates, government consumption, and policy uncertainty in the sense of macroeconomic policy, obviously. And basically what the study showed is that as you keep inflation stable, or as you keep government consumption at a low rate, you deter capital flight. So there was a negative relationship between these variables. The number one variable that these studies used was this sort of idea of a budget deficit. And basically what a lot of the studies found is that debt, large amounts of external debt actually fuel capital flight. So one of the most like shocking studies I found was Nikimana and Boyce in 2008, and they found in their regression results that for every dollar borrowed in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's from 1970 to 2004, that's the time period, for every dollar borrowed, 60 cents of that dollar would leave the country in the form of capital flight. And they actually found that external borrowing was not being used to say like develop the country or for debt relief or things like that, but actually then reinvested abroad. And they said the reason because, this is the reason because enormous amounts of debt actually makes investors feel uncertain about the future value of their assets. So basically they're not sure if there's going to be tax increases because of this large amount of debt. So instead of using the debt to go to something productive, they then get scared by the large amounts of debt and invest it abroad. So that was kind of like, these are the most typical independent variables that were used to explain it. And it makes sense, like when you see an economy more conducive for investment, you'd want to invest domestically instead of abroad. But for my study, I decided to go a little bit differently and look at the political environment instead of like macroeconomic policies. So I looked at like the freedom that people felt in the country. So I have 2 sets of different independent variables. The first one was freedom indicators, that's what I kind of called them, and they're political rights and civil liberties. And so they kind of look at the access that people have to the political parties or political activities and the weakness or how strong political parties are. And they rank them from 7 to 1, and 1 being like completely able to participate politically and have political rights. And then the civil liberties looks at things like freedom of speech and religion and liberties like that. And then 7 being, again, not free, and 1 being completely free. And for both of the variables, I took the 2003 data, and for both of them, they both came to an average of 4, so for political rights and civil liberties, which shows that citizens in these countries in 2003 felt partially free and politically free, but not completely, so there was room to improve. And then the second sort of indicators that I looked at to kind of like help me look at the political environment in the country was governance indicators. And I found that through the World Bank. And I took 4 variables with this, and the rule of law, control and corruption, political stability, and government effectiveness. And they're ranked from negative 2.5 to 2.5, with respectively negative 2.5 being like no rule of law, 0 control on corruption, extreme political instability and things like that, and then 2.5 being like completely political stable and good government effectiveness. And so then I just showed the averages on the bottom, kind of like descriptive statistics for these independent variables. And as you can see, they're all negative, which shows that the governance structure in these countries are pretty poor. Okay, next. So my independent variable was capital flight. And basically, I couldn't do from 1970 to now because that would take forever to calculate. So I chose a smaller time period, and I chose from 1991 to 2004. And I found the total combined capital flight in this region for that time period was 194 billion, which equals around 13 billion a year from the region. And the average country contributed about 4 billion of capital flight during this time. I also, I don't have the data like right here, but I found that the trends of capital flight to be extremely volatile. So in 1997 and 2000, there was capital flight reversal, and it was significant. And then this was attributed to fiscal austerity measures that was occurring in these countries. And then in 2004, there was an extreme decrease in capital flight, and this was due to rise in oil prices from like oil-rich countries in this region. So they actually experienced negative capital flight and kind of offset the whole data set for that year. So I thought that was interesting that it was extremely volatile during this time period, especially since like the technology revolution and the increased capital flows that like the world has been experiencing. And it shows that fiscal policies can affect capital flight, and that the global environment, obviously the economic environment, has something to do with it. Okay, so my expectations for this was that there would be a positive relationship between the freedom felt by the freedom indicator variables and capital flight. And the reason I had to have 2 a priori expectations was they were numerically reverse in nature. So the freedom felt by citizens would go down, the number would go down when they felt more free, and then the governance, when they felt better governance, it would go up. So I had to do 2. So I expected a positive relationship with the freedom indicators and capital flight, and then a negative relationship with the governance indicator variables and capital flight, saying that better governance would make people less likely to invest abroad. Okay, so I had to do 2, like I said, and I found that the relationship between the freedom indicators and capital flight was a positive relationship, but unfortunately it was statistically insignificant. It was only, the R-square was only 0.026. I also then did the governance indicators, regression in relation to capital flight, and with that I actually found a statistically significant result, and that was the R-square was 0.359, showing that there's a 35% change in capital flight can be explained by a change in the governance structure of these countries. So basically then to just focus on the governance structure, since those are like the statistically significant results that I found. Basically, there was an extremely negative relationship between the rule of law, which is kind of obvious, and capital flight. So for every 0.001 increase in that variable, the rule of law variable, the capital flight would decrease by $8,654,000,000 US dollars. So, and also the T-stat was 2.003, which all shows that it's a statistically significant relationship. So rule of law and capital flight are negatively correlated. Controlling corruption and the political stability variables, they did have a negative relationship with capital flight, but they were statistically insignificant. And then the last result that I found, which was the most surprising for me, and I think which like kind of made it even a more interesting research project, was that there was a positive relationship between government effectiveness and capital flight. And it was actually, the T-stat was 4.125, so that was like the most statistically significant thing that I was able to find. And the coefficient showed that for every 0.001 increase in the government effectiveness variable, there was actually an increase in capital flight by 16 billion US dollars. So that shows that when they felt that the government was being more effective, capital flight actually increased. Okay, and so this kind of surprised me, obviously, given my expectations. So I looked back at all the empirical studies that I had been reading, and I realized that it kind of coincided with some of the results that Globerman and Shapiro found in 2002. And this was that an increase in government effectiveness actually increases the existence of, or the creation of, multinational corporations in sub-Saharan Africa. And they used both capital inflows and outflows in this study, and they found that many of the factors that make a country more conducive for inflows of capital and investment also raise the probability and opportunity for capital flight. So it wasn't what I expected, and I realized using their results and my own, I could come up with some conclusions and policy recommendations. And basically my first one focuses on the first relationship that I found, which is that if you increase the rule of law in the country, you are going to deter the already occurring capital flight, specifically the capital flight that's occurring from your citizens investing abroad. So basically, to increase the rule of law, you want to have a strong and transparent legal system, effective and just law enforcement, quality contract, good property rights, transparent budget processing, kind of like the eradication of arbitrariness and corruption. So that's what kind of would increase the rule of law felt in a country. And I feel like that made sense, especially with the other results that I had found, and that these sort of improvements would lead citizens to have higher confidence and expectations on law enforcement and also on the legal system. And this sort of confidence would then lead the citizens to have confidence in investing their assets domestically. So it would increase the legitimacy of the government, and it would then make investors feel safe and secure that they were that the future value of their assets aren't going to be decreased. I also wanted to point out that property rights everyone always focuses on, but I thought what was really interesting is this idea of a transparent budget process. And I feel like this is really important too, because this will equate into investors having more insight into where the tax money's going and sort of into the future of the fiscal policy. So if there's going to be tax increases in the future or whatnot, and that will kind of give them, this insight will kind of give them a sense of security about their assets, investing it domestically. So basically, I felt like a weak rule of law sends a warning message to investors that government may erode the future value. And now the second one, and the more interesting one, is this thing that government effectiveness I found that it increases capital flight. So since Globerman and Shapiro found that an environment is favorable towards a conducive investment environment, it's favorable towards the creation of multinational corporations. Both, it's important, they're both domestically owned multinational corporations and foreign owned. They also experience large amounts of fluctuations of capital inflows and capital outflows. So I thought the way to kind of control this would be like policy on the government's part, and in the form of something called like capital controls. And basically, I said that it's clear that in sub-Saharan Africa during this time, that the governments, even though they may have proved that they're effective in the sort of policies that they wanted to push forward, that they didn't have the proper policies in place to kind of extract economic benefit from the creation of these foreign companies in their country. So as soon as they showed that they were effective, companies would come in and set up, and then they'd take the revenue that they gained, and they would then exchange it into their own domestic currency. And so things that could kind of prevent this from happening and kind of hold like the capital like hostage in their countries, and like they can economically benefit from that, would be things like transaction taxes and caps. And they're kind of controversial, but I feel like they've been kind of picking up in popularity recently. And they would basically just regulate the outflows and inflows of capital into these economies in sub-Saharan Africa. And the second one was exchange controls, and that would kind of limit the buying and selling of national currency. You'd be required to keep a certain amount of the domestic currency and things like that. And that would kind of allow the foreign companies that were in there to invest domestically, and then they could extract like the capital from that. So I like to point out that this is contrary to classical, the notion that firm and social interests converge. I think this is a clear case where it shows that it's not always necessarily the case that the prosperity of the private sector is assumed to lead to economic growth and benefit for all. Maybe the people that are working for these companies, but not the economy as a whole and the people who are not working for it. So basically, just to sum it up, if they were able to keep a stronger rule of law and kind of put in these policies after they have an effective government, they'd be able to decrease, hopefully, capital flight. It all comes down to policy. And if they decrease the capital flight, they'll be able to increase domestic investment, and hopefully that'll lead them to more redistributive power because of the larger tax base, and that'll help alleviate this capital allocation problem that I talked about in the beginning, where like they have extreme amounts of debt and also poor standard of living. So they would help channel the capital into debt relief and social welfare programs, and both of those things help economic growth. So that's it.
We have some questions from the audience, students, faculty. Yes, one.
I knew you'd be.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the methods that you used? It sounded somewhat like just a bivariate regression, or was it a multivariate regression?
It was a multivariable regression. Basically, like I said, I had a lot of independent variables, so I decided that that would be the easiest way to do the multivariable regression. Excuse me.
And did you consider including, it sounds like you included the two sets of variables that you're looking at separately rather than at the same time?
Yeah, I felt like that was because they were from completely different organizations, and even though they both looked at the sort of political feel of the country, I felt like it would be more appropriate to have them separately, and I think that gave me a better understanding of like which actual variable affected it. I thought about doing it combined, but I felt like that was the easier approach, maybe.
Amanda? So is there a relationship between the rule of law and the interpretation of an effective government? So like, it seems like contradictory because when you have to have the rule of law first before a government is perceived effective, or does an effective government implement effective rule of law? I just seem
I thought about that too. And when you look at like what the government effectiveness and how the World Bank kind of measures it, it's not necessarily looking at things like the legal system. It's looking at things like their policies and the goals of those policies and if they were effective or not. So it doesn't necessarily mean they have the right policies. It just means that like they've stated these sort of like goals and then they've been effective in doing that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that property rights even exist and things like that. So I was confused as well at first. All right.
Thank you. Ready, Adrianna?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so my paper was, this is actually my thesis that I wrote last semester, and it was Employer-Sponsored Health Insurance and the U.S. Economy. I began research on this paper last January in the Research Methods course, and when I began looking for a topic, I immediately thought of health insurance. The health insurance industry was a major news topic as Congress debated healthcare reform, and I had just accepted an internship for the upcoming summer at the consulting firm Towers Watson and their Health and Group Benefits department. I wanted to learn more about the area in which I would be working, and I was also taking the Economics of Healthcare course, an elective class that was being offered in light of the healthcare reform. On one of the first days of the course, our professor asked who in the class was in favor of the healthcare reform legislation. No one raised their hand. Then she asked who in the class opposed the healthcare reform being debated, and to my surprise, every single student in the class raised their hand. Then she asked a far more important question. What exactly is it? What is being debated and why is it so controversial? And once again, nobody raised their hand. So this conversation had quite an impact on me as I was very interested in why a group of 25, 19 to 22-year-olds would be so strongly against something when nobody really knew what it was. So this is where I began my research. I wanted to find out what exactly was being debated and the reasons for the push for change. I started by learning more about the U.S. health insurance industry and the employer-based health insurance model that we follow. As of 2009, the majority of Americans, or about 59%, received their health insurance coverage through an employer. The United States is the only country to follow this model and the only developed nation not to offer some type of universal coverage. The employer-sponsored model became popular in 1942 after the Stabilization Act imposed strict wage controls on firms but exempted insurance and pension benefits. Employer-offered benefits appeal to workers as they eliminate the time and search costs for looking for an individual plan and provide a stable insurance pool over which risk and administrative costs can be spread. Employer coverage is also popular as it is excluded from the determination of employees' federal income taxes and employers' federal employment taxes and state income and employment taxes, all of which result in significant savings for employers and employees. Yet, despite the benefits of the employer-based model, U.S. Census data revealed that about 45.7 million Americans were uninsured in 2009. This means that approximately 1 out of every 6 adults, or 16% of the U.S. adult population, did not have adequate health coverage. Although the government created the Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP programs, funded by taxpayers designed to fill the holes within the employer-based health insurance model, it is obvious that there are still sectors of the population that cannot attain any type of coverage. During my preliminary research, I heard a lot of news and government outlets mentioning how health insurance coverage rates had reached all-time lows. This made sense to me because of the current economic recession. If the majority of the country depends on their employer for health insurance, or the employer of a spouse or parent, it seems intuitive that coverage rates would decline as the unemployment rate was rising. So this made me think, as unemployment rises, the number of people with jobs and therefore employer-based insurance would decline, which would make this employer-based model dependent on the state of the economy and the strength of U.S. businesses, which leads me to my research question. Is the current employer-based health insurance system in the United States dependent on domestic economic activity and therefore a deterrent to more broad-based health coverage and sustainable healthcare spending in the U.S.? I performed a multiple regression analysis using annual time series data from 1979 to 2009 in order to test my hypothesis. I chose to do a time series study on an annual basis, largely due to the fact that health insurance data is not readily compiled on more frequent intervals. My dependent variable is the percent of the population aged 18 to 64 with employer-based health insurance, policyholders only. I obtained this dependent variable data from the article Health Insurance Coverage Rates for U.S. Workers, 1979 to 2008.
Is it out of column maybe? Or?
I think so, yeah.
No, we can just plug in directly
Oh,
here.
okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Okay. So I obtained this variable from an article published by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, for the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. This kind of data is pretty hard to find, and it took me about 6 months to actually find this dependent variable data, mainly because the Bureau of Labor Statistics current population survey is really the only thing that asks for health insurance questions in their surveys. And they have 2 different series of data on their website that are separate because of changes in the survey's implementation and the methodology of asking health insurance questions. So the authors of the article that I found took the 2 sets of data and identified 4 subperiods where the survey was the same. And so they identified 3 major breaks in the continuity of the data. And they worked backwards from the current survey and kind of spliced changes that would make the preceding series on a basis that's consistent with the next series. So they, in order to put historical data on a basis that is consistent with the current population survey, which resulted in a reasonable series of employment-based health insurance data for the whole time period. I chose 4 independent variables to compare to this dependent variable, and the first was the U.S. unemployment rate from 1979 to 2009. I obtained this data, which reflects the civilian non-institutional labor force that is unemployed from the current population survey. And I chose that unemployment rate because I think it is a good indicator of the health of the economy, as low unemployment is a sign of a healthy, growing economy, and high unemployment is a sign usually of economic distress. And I expected to find a negative relationship between the U.S. employment rate and the percent of the population with an employer. I was hoping that this negative relationship would help prove my hypothesis that the insurance rates are dependent on the business cycle and therefore potentially inefficient. My second independent variable was national health expenditures as a percent of total U.S. GDP in the same time period. I chose annual health spending even though it includes factors outside of health insurance because it shows how much of our domestic budget is devoted to health care, despite the fact that millions of Americans still do not have health insurance coverage. I thought it would be interesting to test this variable to see if the changes in the clear increase in healthcare spending over the years has had a significant impact on the percent of Americans covered by an employer. And I obtained this data from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services. And I expected to find a negative relationship between this variable and the dependent variable. As health expenditures rise, I thought I would find a smaller percentage of the population covered by an employer, as the rising costs would make it more expensive for both employers and employees, forcing one or both parties to drop coverage. My third independent variable that I tested was employer costs per hour's work for employee compensation and costs towards health insurance as a percent of total compensation. And I chose this variable because the cost of employee compensation for health insurance may help prove that health insurance has become an unsustainable cost for businesses. And this survey began in 1986, so I did not have the 30 necessary data points that you kind of would like for a statistical model, but I still wanted to evaluate it, include it in my model, because I thought it would be sort of useful to look at how compensation costs have changed for health insurance. And I obtained this data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics Employer Costs for Employee Compensation Survey. and I expected to find a negative relationship with the dependent variable, the employer-sponsored rates of insurance. I expected employers to begin to drop coverage as these compensation costs became more expensive, thus decreasing the percent of the population covered by an employer. And the final independent variable that I chose were the median usual weekly earnings of full-time wage and salary workers. The data was obtained from the current population survey and is constant dollar data adjusted for to the 1982 to 1984 CPI to eliminate inflation. And I chose wages because I thought it would represent another estimate of business performance and the strength of the economy, as increased wages could be a sign that businesses are performing well and profits are rising, and that decreasing wages can also be an economic indicator, as it can be a sign that businesses are not as performing well and budgets are getting tighter. Decreasing wages could also be a sign that the economy is experiencing little, zero, or even negative growth. So I expected to find a positive relationship between wages and the percent of the population covered by an employer. I thought that as median weekly earnings would decrease, you would also see that decrease in the dependent variable and the percent of the population covered by an employer. It may also be worth noting that I originally tested two other independent variables, labor productivity as measured by output per hour in the non-farm business sector, and I'd use the Dow Jones Industrial Average because I thought they would be good indicators of the performance of major firms and help link the dependent variable to changes in the U.S. business cycle. However, I eventually eliminated them for my model as they proved to be too cyclical on an annual basis to perform trend analysis, and the preliminary regression output showed that they did not have statistically significant relationships with the dependent variable. So then I compiled the results. I ran two separate regression outputs, the first with the 3 independent variables that had 31 data points, and then a separate one with the employer costs for employee compensation, since it had only 24 data points. And through these analyses, I found that my results were consistent with my a priori expectations for 3 of the 4 independent variables, the national health expenditures, the employer costs for compensation, and median weekly earnings. They were all significant at the 5% level, and I had hypothesized the negative relationships between the national health expenditures and the employer costs for compensation, which means that as the percent of the population with employer coverage is declining, the health expenditures and compensation costs are rising. And I'd also anticipated the positive relationship between the wages and the dependent, meaning that as the employer-sponsored coverage rates decline, so are wages. However, I did not hypothesize a significant positive relationship between the average unemployment rate and the dependent variable. I had thought that as unemployment rate rose, the percent of the population covered by an employer would decline. But however, the data revealed that as the percent of the population with employer health coverage actually rises as the unemployment rate rises. And I tried to think of a number of reasons for this result. First, the unemployment rate is a lagging indicator, meaning that certain shocks to the economy may not be immediately reflected in the data, which could impact the results. I also thought it'd be worth investigating the demographics of the population with employer-based coverage to see if there were trends within certain age groups or income levels. It is possible that as unemployment rate rises, more employees may be eligible for Medicaid rather than their employer insurance, and that older employees could choose to partake in Medicare rather than their employer's plans. And the different health insurance take-up rates for single employees versus families could be a factor. One of the studies in my literature review showed that young singles have the lowest participation rates in employer-sponsored insurance, but that they view health insurance as more valuable in times of recession in order to protect against the cost risks of medical care. The positive relationship may also be the result of the overwhelming downward trend of the dependent variable. If we focused on a shorter time period with more frequent data measures, I could possibly have captured a more accurate relationship between the variables, which might have changed the results a little bit. The positive relationship between wages and the dependent variable suggests there's a link between the employer coverage rates and economic performance. However, it's a little inconclusive because wage data is not strictly a business cycle indicator. Studies on wage stickiness and the downward rigidity of wages have shown that they are less likely to fluctuate downward in times of, in economic downturns, as firms hesitate to make wage cuts even in times of recession. The negative relationship I found between health expenditures and the employer costs for compensation with the dependent shows that there are some serious inefficiencies within the insurance industry. It's the rise in the national health expenditures, despite the number of uninsured, is a sign that the money we allocate towards health insurance is not having a significant positive impact on the most common form of insurance coverage in the U.S. And the trend of rising spending, despite the large number of uninsured, played a large role in the development and passing of the healthcare reform legislation in early 2010. And it remains to be seen if these reform measures can help curb the spending in the long run and raise the percent of the population that is insured both publicly and privately. Similarly, as employers are spending more to provide health insurance to their employees, the percent of the population with employer coverage has been declining, and the rise in this compensation spending points to the high cost of the employer system and that fewer employees are declining to take up insurance because of the cost. And I think that it shows that despite the business case for providing health insurance, it's a growing cost burden to both firms and employees who are choosing not to partake into the health insurance offered. In light of the new employer and individual mandates from the reform legislation, it will be interesting to see how this variable is affected and if those measures will help the overall insurance rates to improve. Overall, the discovery of the positive relationship with the U.S. unemployment rate and the dependent variable negated my hypothesis that the employer-based health insurance coverage system is dependent on the business cycle. The average unemployment rate data is considered one of the best overall economic performance indicators, and without the negative relationship that I hypothesized, it is hard to draw firm conclusions about the reliance of employer health coverage on the state of the economy. However, I think that the results showed that there are some issues and maybe a weak link between the two, and further research is needed in this area to determine to evaluate and determine the performance of the health insurance system. And moving forward, it will be important to monitor the progress of the new healthcare legislation to see if its provisions are sufficient to end the decline in employage coverage rates and increase firms' abilities to provide affordable and comprehensive coverage at a reasonable cost.
Comment.
Sure.
One thing that you could do is use initial unemployment claims as opposed to unemployment rate. I've heard that sometimes that's a little bit better.
Right,
and
a little
it's
bit.
also weekly. You can get it weekly from the St. Louis Fed, so you may want to try that.
Right, that's a good question. Thank you.
I wouldn't do that actually.
Anyone else? Yes, Kristen?
Something you said initially when you were describing the data suggested that some of these things might be available on a regional level, and that would open up the possibility of doing a panel analysis where you have both across regions and across time. If you did that, that would obviously give you a lot more variation to work with.
Right.
And it would also potentially allow you to address the problem of a changing measure of healthcare coverage, because you could simply have categorical variables that covered at different time periods. So if you're looking for more time to do that.
Another good place to look. Thank you.
All right, for my presentation, for my paper, I decided to look at income inequality among the middle and upper classes in relation to white-collar crime rates. I did this in the context of a criminological theory called anomie theory, which I've learned about in various criminal justice classes that I've taken. So before I start, I'm just going to go over some very general definitions that are necessary to kind of understanding the context in which I'm choosing my variables. So first off, what is white-collar crime? There's differing definitions that have been used throughout time. The first person to ever use the term white-collar crime, his name was Edwin Sutherland, and in 1939 in a speech, he defined it as a crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status in the course of his occupation. But throughout time, that definition has sort of changed to kind of involve more crimes which deal with non-physical or violent means. So for the purpose of this study, I used the definition developed by Edelhertz in 1970, which, as I said, emphasized more the non-physical means of committing a crime, the concealment of the actions, and the objective of that was to obtain money, property, or personal advantage. Anomie theory was developed by a man named Robert Merton in 1957. The idea of anomie theory is that there's an enduring situation in society in which there's a generalized goal of material success, and that's promoted, but the means to achieve that success are not evenly distributed, to achieve that success legitimately, excuse me. He was the first to sort of suggest that social structures can influence people to commit crime, and the way that they do this is they adapt to the strain that they're faced with. So one of these adaptations to strain is innovation, and these innovations result in illegal behavior because they're thinking up new ways to achieve the same success. Later in 1994, Mesner and Rosenfeld, who are pretty famous now in terms of the criminal justice community, they developed the institutional anomie theory, which is kind of a subset of anomie theory. So I saw this chart and I thought that it explained things on a general level fairly well. So their main idea was that the American culture is caught up in the idea of monetary success through the competition for limited resources. The economic values penetrate other social institutions, which I'll explain what some of those institutions are in a little bit. But these culturally produced pressures serve to weaken the controls that the other social institutions provide. And those weakened controls sort of, as you can see, it's sort of a semicircle right there, so that it's just kind of contributes to the problem while causing the problem at the same time. And all of this leads to increased crime rates. So that's the framework with which I went about my study. There was well, I guess I should preface this by saying that institutional anomie theory was originally developed as a theory for street crimes or property crimes and not white-collar crimes. But recently, there's been a few empirical studies done, specifically by Schopenhauer and Picaro, who are professors down at Florida State University, that look at it through white-collar crime. So basically, what Mesner and Rosenfeld in their theory set out was that there are four major social institutions. There's the economy, there's the institution of education, there's the family, and then there's the polity or government. What I want to look at specifically in my paper was the impact of relative income inequality between the middle class and the upper class. So the theory being that white-collar crimes are committed by more affluent and educated individuals, and thus using something such as the Gini ratio, which is a measure of overall income inequality, might not be applicable, and that my measure, which I'll describe in a little bit, might be more applicable. So the dependent variable that I used in my study was the number of white-collar criminal acts as measured by the number of offenses per 100,000 residents in the United States. This data is published by the FBI in their uniform crime reports that they generate every single year. Under the white-collar crime rates, three major crimes are included. At least they're classified as such by police officers when they report it. There's embezzlement, there's fraud, and then there's identity theft. And I obtained data from 1964 to 2007 to run a multivariate time series regression, which I'll describe my independent variables on the next page. But I did that because I couldn't get data for some of my variables past that time. So under the institution of the economy, I included the 2-year lagged unemployment rate. And I did this because there were many studies done about property crime and specifically burglary and robbery that found significant relationships between lagged unemployment and their rates. So I thought that maybe in terms of white collar crime, that might also be applicable. I also chose the unemployment rate because it's used in a few studies as well as a general indicator of economic conditions. And then my own variable that I included, since that was a measure of overall economic conditions, I included a relative deprivation measure, which was the difference in the upper limit of incomes between the 3rd and 4th quintiles of American families. For the institution of the education, I included the percent of the population that did not graduate high school. I did this because white-collar criminals are more likely to have education than other defendants. There was a study done by Wheeler, I think it was, but he studied over 1,400 people who were convicted of white-collar crimes and offenses and found that they were more likely to be employed, educated, and well off. Under the institution of the polity, or government, I went with the theory that the purpose of the criminal justice system and our overall government, which enacts the laws, is to deter individuals from engaging in illegal behavior. So in 1984, the mandatory sentencing guidelines were established, and these produced guaranteed sentences for certain crimes to alleviate disparity in sentencing. Up until that time, there was the widespread notion that white-collar criminals were let off easy, that they would go to court accused of doing certain white-collar crimes, but the judge would let them off with probation or something. So the theory being that with more guaranteed sentencing, the inclination to commit crime would decrease. For the institution of the family, I went off of the study I mentioned before, Picaro and Schopenhauer, and they did a rate that, a ratio which showed the divorce rate per 1,000 citizens divided by the crude marriage rate per 1,000 citizens. This is supposed to show the strength of the family institution, the theory being that the primary purpose of the family is to insulate you from the pressures of the American dream, which they established as the drive to for wealth in a competitive atmosphere. But an increased size of this ratio would represent a decreased ability for the family to do so. In other words, it would lead to higher levels of family disorganization if the divorce rate went up or the marriage rate went down. So this is my overall model. I chose to do a log-log model because pretty much every single study that I saw which analyzed crime rates assumed a log-log model. Obviously, I couldn't do it for the dummy variables, so that with respect to that variable, it's a semi-log model. But otherwise, yeah, that's what it looks like. So these are my preliminary results. As you can see, the F statistic of the overall regression is 48.9, which is extremely robust. The adjusted R squared is 0.848, and the Durbin-Watson statistic, which for the technically inclined, is a measure of serial correlation. In a one-tailed test for positive serial correlation, if using that statistic, it's uncertain whether there is serial correlation in the model or not. I'll get to the variable, the betas which were generated on the next page, but my suggestion to alleviate that, if I had the resources to, which I didn't for this paper, but is to use Newey West standard errors since all the betas were theoretically correct. So here are the results of the regression, the real results. As you can see, the lagged unemployment variable is significant at a 5% level in a one-tailed test for significance. And same with the the high school measure and the divorce to marriage ratio, significantly so. The main variable of the study, the income inequality measure, is not significant at a 5% level, but it is at a 10% level. But that being so, if you look at the VIF number there, which is 23.3, that's a very high variance inflation factor, and that's a sign of multi-collinearity. So what's interesting to see is that the high school variable also has a VIF over 10, so there might be some interplay between the two, but because the high school variable is significant and the income variable may or may not be significant, it's kind of hard to tell. It's preliminarily, we'll leave it in there. So there are a number of limitations with this model. The first being, obviously, what I just said, that there's mixed support for the significance of the relative income inequality measure. And another less obvious limitation is that there's no authoritative measure of each social institution. And beyond that, this theory only chooses 4 social institutions. There might be some others which are important, but under the theory of institutional anomie theory, there could be more. And also, there's a lot of limitations with the dependent variable. White-collar crime is notoriously hard to detect. All the rates which are generated are reported by police, so that doesn't count the numerous white-collar crimes that aren't detected or just aren't chosen to be pursued by the police. So the true amount of crime could be much higher, and that could alter the results and interpretations of the model. In terms of conclusions, I would say that the study highlights a real need to focus on different socioeconomic factors, specifically those of the middle class and the upper class, in determining white-collar crime rates. The policy implications are pretty clear. You really have to measure, you have to strengthen the non-economic institutions. And you can do this in a number of ways. You can target the education institution by increasing just funding for schools or giving people credits to attain more education or encouraging people to stay in school longer, especially public school. Tax cuts for the middle class to alleviate the income inequality between them and the upper class, but that opens up a whole different set of policy implications if you're looking at overall income inequality between the lower class and the middle class, which might increase different types of crime and not white-collar crime. And perhaps, for me, one of the most interesting, granted not really, well, sort of economic implications that come from this study is if we go back and we look at the significance of the insignificance, of the mandatory sentencing variable. That proves that a strong response in terms of the law establishing a punishment for white-collar crime might not be the answer. What might be the answer is increased funding for police to go after more white-collar crime. I worked at the Delaware County Criminal Investigation Division. My predecessor is also sitting in the audience, so he could tell you this too. But when we were there, we were working on cases from 2006 and 2007, and I was there at the beginning of 2010. So they're really far behind, and the only answer to that is to get more people working on these cases, because there is no shortage of cases. They're all reported. It's just they have to deal with them in order, and they're just backlogged so much. So questions going forward, I would say that while my model kind of looked at it from a macro perspective, I think looking at each firm individually is also very important. What causes the motivation within these firms to commit white-collar crime, and how do those opportunities arise? The structure of organizations, as I said, is very important. The tone ethically from the organization stems from the top and is taught through management to the everyday workers, the lowest on the totem pole. They're a reflection of the ethical tone that's set. And just looking at what effect that plays might be another worthwhile study to look into. And in terms of the effect of the policy implications, as I said, if we take measures to maybe enforce white-collar crime, there might be ramifications for what other types of crime, could go up as well. And as I said before, if we work to reduce the income inequality between the middle class and the upper class, that might spill over into other classes and more income inequality between them, which could lead to increased violent crime rates such as murder or vehicle theft or something along those lines. So that is my presentation, and if there are any questions, I'd gladly take them.
I'll lead off instead of finishing this time. So your dependent variable was sort of the incidence of crime, right?
Yes.
How frequent it was. And yet when you get to the policy conclusions about what we should do, that really comes down to sort of a cost-benefit trade-off, right? Because presumably all those things we talked about would have costs to implement it.
Yes.
And so that suggests then that another possible dependent variable that might allow you to get closer to what's the cost of the crimes would be not the number of crimes, but the value of the crimes.
I would definitely agree. That was probably the hardest thing that I came up with, trying to identify a dependent variable. In the end, there's a lot of problems with the one that I ended up choosing. And really, there's no adequate measure of, ideally, I would use something along those lines because I definitely agree with you, but just there isn't anything out there. There's a lot of problems with the crime rates, but they do have some value, and I tried to get as much value from them as I could.
I can think of one easy way of doing this is if you wanted to keep going at it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is to use LexisNexis to search the Wall Street Journal and just add up how many, what the dollar figure that they report for the major white-collar crimes in each year. And that would give you some idea. So you have a Bernie Madoff, that's going to snuff a lot of
That'd be like an outlier. Yeah.
And that might be able to get you some figure that's at least ballpark like that.
No, that's a very good idea because I agree with you. Some of these incidents are very small in nature, and then some are big.
And if you want to do New West, jump on that.
What other institutions do you think you'd want to collect data on, or you think, even if you could collect data on, do you think would be important? You said that you think other institutions would.
I think that one of the glaring omissions from it was the institution of religion. I think that to a real degree that does have significant value, maybe in different parts of the country more, depending on what religion you are. But some measure of that probably would have been nice to include. But like I said, in terms of institutional anomie theory, they didn't include it. I guess.
You could just expand it.
Yeah, I could make my own theory.
I was also thinking about how you define family, because I know I've done some work, especially for the state of Pennsylvania and stuff. And the question is, like, how do you define family? Because family is so different, and people seem to live in very extended families, and so it may not be like the traditional as you're thinking of, but that's still a family. So, is this kind of the thing, like, what's happening with families?
No.
I understand you're saying that, but the question then is really, how do you even define family?
Well,
That's
one thing I forgot to mention was that that divorce could be interpreted in two ways. A number of these variables that I use could be interpreted in two ways. If divorce was measured as an increase in family disruption, it could also mark the end of family disruption. It could be that the family was experiencing troubles before that, and then the divorce, everyone goes their separate ways, they're feeling better, yada, yada, yada. But it's all open to interpretation a little bit.
The anomie theory, does it postulate any lags, or are they saying that the dependent variable white-collar crime depends on current income inequality, current divorce rates, and so on?
Let me think how best to respond. The reason I chose the lagged unemployment rate was because unemployment is typically viewed as a lagging variable of current economic conditions. So I did originally include the regular unemployment rate in my regression, and then just to compare, I included the lagged unemployment rate, and I found that the lagged unemployment rate had a much more significant impact than regular unemployment did. And I took that to mean that unemployment is a lagging indicator of economic conditions, which is why I included that. But then current income inequality, I thought it doesn't really matter how much you view yourself as being less well off than others 2 years ago. It depends on how you view yourself now in relation to it, which is why I didn't lag that variable.
But the theory itself in the literature, does it postulate any specific lags, or they are just discussed in general?
In general, I would say. The theory that I based it off of was more sociological in nature. I tried to make it into an empirical economic analysis. So they suggested unemployment rate. They also suggested the inflation rate, which I didn't look into. But then I kind of just ran with the lagged unemployment rate myself. Yeah.
You looked at the inflation, adjusted difference between the third and fourth income.
Yes, yes I did.
Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Just thank you to everyone who was on the committee, and thank you to the donor, even though he's not here. I'd also like to recognize Professor Thanawala, who was my thesis instructor, and Professor Kilby, who taught me for both macroeconomic theory and microeconomic theory. And,
You survived both?
it was tough. I definitely couldn't have done it in one semester, that's for sure. So I guess partly inspired by macroeconomic theory is the leading economic index, an examination of timeliness, relevance, and reliability. So pretty much I'm going to be talking to you guys a lot about leading economic indicators and a composite of those leading economic indicators. So I'll be starting with a little bit of a background, and then, just like everyone else, kind of working my way into my model and kind of giving you what the results were of my experiment. So, quick pop quiz, keep everyone involved. What do these dates have in common? Yeah, they are. That's actually what the last person said too. Yeah? Yeah, so this is when the employment report is released. And as mentioned in the past two presentations, we have unemployment rate. And this is kind of very notable because it's always reported in the financial press. And while a lot of people look at this, a lot of policymakers look at this rate, it's obviously a lagging indicator, as mentioned by pretty much everyone. So I kind of, when I first started kind of examining leading economic indicators, I kind of realized that, wow, it's really important to know which ones actually do lead and which ones actually don't. And it's especially important so you can know what phase you are in the business cycle. So, you know, there are 5 main phases of the business cycle: recovery, expansion, maturation, ease off, and plunge. And, you know, different indicators will either be showing you whether or not there is a, you know, maybe they'll lead the change in the business cycle, or maybe they will lag the change in the business cycle. So, for example, unemployment would be coming, you know, right now it's coming down, but we are actually in an expansion phase. So just for an example, you know, that's a lagging indicator. There's also coincident indicators, which are moving with the economy at the same time. So, you know, that basically is supposed to represent what the economy is doing right now today. And then what I focus on is the leading economic indicators. And as someone who in the future hopes to be maybe in the financial markets, or maybe a policymaker, maybe, you know, working, making strategic decisions for businesses, I'm someone who would want to care about these leading indicators and which ones are the most effective and which ones I should be looking at. So, you know, the LEI is put out by the conference board and attempts to compile all these different leading indicators into one index. And you can see right here that it's done a pretty good job actually of predicting recessions. So you can see that it starts to trend downward as the arrows indicate that there is a recession coming. So the LEI actually has 10 component parts, and the conference board deems these the 10, you know, most important leading indicators to look at, especially when combined. So they, you know, you can see the weightings on the side. So it actually gives specific preferences to money supply, weekly hours worked. Mainly, I was really surprised about the money supply when I first looked at this. But these are the 10 components that are supposed to be able to predict the economy 6 months in advance. So maybe you're asking this, maybe you're not, but so what really, what have they been doing right now? And, you know, we have initial jobless claims starting to decline. They've actually gone a a lot lower since this graph was made. But and building permits have actually stabilized, but they're not increasing like a normal recession. So it's important to look at the component parts. And continued consumer confidence didn't do that well. But there's also non-farm payroll, which is not actually in the leading index because it is in the coincident index. And so this is what the leading economic index is trying to predict. So the term is reference cycle, and the term reference cycle means that it is basically a gauge for the economy right now. So non-farm payroll, personal income, industrial production, and manufacturing and trade sales, those four things combined with certain weightings, actually 50% is non-farm payroll, is actually supposed to represent where the economy is exactly right now. It's not supposed to have any predictive purposes, despite what you might see in the financial markets where non-farm payroll moves the economy in a wide variety of different directions when it's released. That is actually just telling you where you are right now, not 6 months in the future, which is the most valuable. So anyway, moving on towards the literature, you can kind of see that, asking the question, what is an effective leading indicator? So, timeliness, accuracy, these are all very important parts. These first four are kind of what all the literature agree on is the most important parts of a leading indicator, at least for the component parts. And then for the indexes, we have smoothness. And smoothness is actually very important for an index because the whole point of the index of leading economic indicators is to smooth out the fluctuations that each individual component part has. So, for example, initial jobless claims will kind of move around. It was at, 388,000 last week, now it's at 412,000. So, what is that telling you on a week-by-week basis or even a month-by-month basis? Maybe it's kind of misinforming you. So you have to smooth it out with the index, and that's kind of the whole point of using this LEI. Going a little deeper into the literature, it kind of started in 1938 with Mitchell and Burns, and they actually didn't even have 5 phases of the business cycle then. They just had expansion and contraction. They simplified it down pretty simply. And they actually started with 487 series and narrowed it down to 71, including some things that seem really silly nowadays, like building plans Manhattan and orders of oak flooring. So imagine trying to predict, what non-farm payroll is going to be with orders of oak flooring. Probably pretty tough, especially in 2011, but this is what they were looking at back in 1938. Geoffrey Moore, actually in 1960, compiled what kind of looks like the LEI today. And he also looked at diffusion indices, which I did not look at in my paper. However, I feel like it's very important to mention because it is very often used a lot in literature. But anyway, moving forward to Stock and Watson, which is kind of where I would say the bulk of modern LEI, leading economic index thought comes from. And that's where you have this joint model where the LEI is trying to predict the coincident index 6 months in the future. And along with that, they also talked about a recession index, which I do not mention, but it is the percentage in the next 6 months that a recession is going to occur. And then there's also yield curve analysis, which actually up until this time, no one kind of realized or really proved that the inverted yield curve was very, very effective at predicting the reference cycle. And now it's actually considered one of the best at predicting the reference cycle. So just you can see, in 1989, anything in bold is actually still in the leading economic index, and so you can see, 6 or 7 that are still in it today. There's a couple things that are different, but clearly this would probably do a pretty good job today. But even more recent literature includes real-time information, which at first I was interested in maybe trying to pursue, but then I realized it was way too difficult and way too hard to try and create an index immediately when the data comes out. But it is trying to be pursued in some recent literature. Performance of new models, of course. Everyone's trying to put out a new model that predicts the reference cycle better. Financial variables like the yield curve have recently become a hot topic for predicting the reference cycle. And kind of what I focused on, which wasn't really that much touched in the literature, was the behavior in the most recent recession. So it seemed to me in just surveying the literature that there was a clear need to kind of have an understanding of, is this time different or is it not? The big question, have things actually changed? Is this a totally different economy, or is it the same old economy where you can just kind of tell what's going on from these component parts? So that's my research question. What was the effectiveness of the leading economic index during the most recent recession, and what changes or improvements could be made to make this index actually a lot more relevant? So, going to your project, you need to have your a priori expectations. So I kind of thought that the current components would do a very good job. There's really no need to think that they wouldn't, especially since you can just tell by the financial markets when certain numbers are released, they move very swiftly into the direction that they either surprise or surprise to the downside. So something like jobless claims I was expecting to be very good, something like money supply, but I kind of wasn't expecting vendor performance to do very well. I hadn't really heard of it before doing some research into it. Survey of consumer expectations. I'm someone who's kind of skeptical that consumers actually know what they're talking about when they take surveys. And then new orders, because new orders from manufacturing, I thought we maybe had moved into a more service-based economy, so maybe manufacturing wouldn't really be that big of a deal as far as our economy is concerned. However, we have potential replacements. I actually looked at 11, which will be on the next slide, but the ones that I really expected to succeed were ISM non-manufacturing for the same reason as the other one, small business optimism, and although this next one, PMI, is manufacturing based, it's a survey, so maybe they have a better idea going forward. I feel like that would be different than consumer expectations. Consumers really don't know what they're doing, but maybe manufacturers do. At least that's what I thought going in. So these are just all the independent variables that I looked at. Some had higher expectations than others. I had very low expectations for help wanted ads that didn't really make a lot of sense to me, but I read some literature that it might be effective. Anyway, so moving on to the model, we have just how my model works. So the only dependent variable is that coincident index, and then I have the 21 independent variables. So all those variables that I showed you that were in the already component LEI and the 11 that I'm trying out. And so you just have to think of for this lagged 6 months, you just have to think about what we're talking about here. So, I'm trying to match or find a correlation between the COI or coincident index and the leading index. So you need to move back the leading index 6 months because that's what the number is trying to predict. Hopefully everyone followed that, but it's just to make sure that times match. And then we have 5 years of data, so 63 observations, just so we're focusing on the most recent recession, and your simple regression analysis. We have 3 steps: simple linear regression to weed out indicators that are clearly just not working even on the singular level. Then correlation analysis to get rid of some more variables that are just so obviously correlated that there'd be no reason to include both of them. And then some multivariate regression iterations to kind of narrow our way down to the best possible set of parts for the LEI, or my new proposed LEI, I guess. So we have the simple linear regressions, and the best performer from just a single observed variable standpoint was the rate spread. As I mentioned earlier, it has become pretty well known as a great measure for what's going on 6 months later in the economy. And vendor performance, which is actually really terrible. It really doesn't seem to predict anything, at least on an individual basis. So despite vendor performance, very low performance, we have component parts outperforming. So just in general, the ones that were already in there have done much better than what I was proposing, which kind of makes a lot of sense because there has been a lot of research done in this field. But you can just see the rate spread fit line and some of the regression statistics for that did very well. I did this for every single independent variable that I was looking at and weeded my way through there. So some more results just from correlation analysis. Obviously, housing starts and building permits. I'm pretty much going to have to choose one of them. I ended up going with building permits just because it was already in the index. And it's also better for seasonally adjusted things, just because you can't actually start a house when it's 10 inches of snow outside. But then there's also light auto sales and light truck sales, and light truck sales did a better job in the simple linear regressions, so I ended up going with that. So moving on to my final third step, where we're including all the different variables. we just have the current LEI, which ended up with an R squared of 97.6%. So the coefficient of determination actually proved that the LEI was very, very useful during this most recent recession. And that was pretty hard to beat. Pretty much, I saw that and I said, well, I'm not really going to be adding that much value to society, am I? But, but I kind of started to plug in my variables into a 14-factor model, work my way down to 10-factor model, kind of stayed about the same, slightly better than the LEI. And then something that I was interested in, I kept working my way down, and there were just 4 variables that ended up predicting 97.36% of the observation for the variation of the observations. So, this is the new 10-factor model that I ended up coming up with this method. It included private non-farm payrolls, so just the private sector as far as non-farm payrolls is concerned, and PMI. So you can just see the 10-factor model there and the regression results. And the 4-factor model, which would be the rate spread, M2, PMI, and jobless claims. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that this will work all the time going forward, but kind of what I would be saying is that this, in an explanatory sense, does a great job for the most recent recession. So you can just look at these factors as kind of explaining what happened. And also, just the idea that we can have a 4-factor model kind of shows that maybe you don't need 10 factors in the LEI, and you could kind of narrow it down a little bit, or maybe if you kind of have an understanding of what's going on in the market, you can just tailor what indicators you're looking at to a specific, just a few specific component parts. You can just see the output for that. But so just some problems and limitations with this study, and I admit there are a lot. So my model does not include weights. So if you remember from earlier, M2 was given a 32% weight. You really don't have that in a regression analysis. You just everything's given equal weighting for the correlations. There are a lot of revisions, and not only the next week when there's a revision, but sometimes from maybe even a year later, they'll just revise their data. So maybe the LEI won't be as effective as predicting the coincident index if this data ends up being revised or something like that, or maybe it's not as valuable to businesses or financial markets because it's always getting revised. And then we also have time constraints, the lack of diffusion index, as I mentioned earlier, and just in general the limited statistical analysis of an undergraduate. Just in general, there's a lot of forecasters out there, and a lot of people really knowing what they're doing with these leading indicators. So I'm not saying that my 4-factor model has defined what the economy is going to be for the next 30 years. And then there's leading indices where we have just in general there's a lot of problems. So the reference cycle, that just in general kind of might not make a lot of sense. Just to define the entire economy at this moment in time as 4 things, it's kind of silly. But I mean, you need something to be able to predict. There's a lot of research that can go into whether or not what they have right now is the best model. You have different business cycle phases that could introduce different problems for different indicators. So unemployment might do better during plunge phase, or the rate spread might do better during the expansion phase. Who really knows? That could definitely go into more analysis and, as I mentioned earlier, real-time updates. So again, conclusions and benefits of the study. We now have some sort of explanation for economic indicators during the most recent recession. We can kind of see that this time is not different. The LEI did a very good job of predicting the coincident index, and you need that multi-factor model because just one variable is never going to explain what the whole economy is doing, and maybe you only need those few series that I mentioned earlier. So going forward, if you are interested in these leading series, we have initial jobless claims was just released. Industrial production, consumer confidence was today. Next Tuesday, housing starts and building permits, and the LEI will be next Thursday, survey at 0.3%. If anyone has any questions or comments, I'll be happy to listen and answer them.
You're required that.
I really liked it. The one suggestion I would have is I would focus more on the question of is this time different that you have, and not on proposing a new LEI, in particular because the method that you're using data mining in the bad sense, meaning that you're by starting off with 63 observations and then running through a lot of different permutations of those
Yeah, you end
variables
up with whatever the best is, regardless. Yeah.
for that one recession, which is interesting for comparing it
Yeah.
backward and then saying, is it like other recessions? But it's not really a good way to move forward because it's
And say that this is going to predict the future. You would want to, do it over different time periods.
right. And maybe you could even, divide up all the data you have into two parts and develop the model in one part with all the data mining you want,
Yeah.
but then test it with the other part to see if it holds.
Yeah, and I would just, test it from when I stopped kind of doing this last year for the last maybe like 5-6 months or something like that.